Hello, everyone. My name's Daniel with Blow the Shofar, and today I have another meeting with Adam from Parable of the Vineyard. This is our continuing series to seek out new truth and improve civilization, to boldly go where no Torah community has gone before. Um,
Good one.
so our goal here is that we're both pursuing the truth. We have different interpretations of Scripture, and when two people have different interpretations, somebody is in error. We don't want to cast judgment on each other. We want to be humility, accept that, hey, maybe we have it wrong, maybe they have it right. So we're going to explore the difference in opinion between my view, which is a lunar Sabbath, and Adam's view, which is a Saturday Sabbath. So Adam, thank you so much for coming on and doing these calls with me.
Thanks for having me back. It's been enjoyable to discuss our differences in love and just hearing from some of our brothers and sisters out there in the body that it's been a refreshing to see that brothers can disagree on some major topics and still have fellowship, still have love for one another. So praise yeah. Glad to be doing this with you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to take the lead and make my case for the lunar Sabbath. And one of the things we want to try to do is not go too far in any one direction. I'm going to present some stuff, let Adam respond to it, and then go on so that we can have a discussion about each piece of the evidence as we go, instead of, we have our own channels where we've already both presented our case thoroughly, if you want to see just one side or the other all laid out at once. But the purpose here is to deep dive step by step to see if at any point in the process, one of us made an assumption or missed something, and just get each other's take. Like, how do you respond to this or that individual points so that people can see how that's going. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I think that's the right window. Okay. Can you see that, Adam? All right. So I'm going to start off by just reading the scripture that defines the Sabbath. Now, this is going to be a new insight into the scripture that I just had last night. And we're open up with that just to expand our point of view. So Exodus 20, verse 8 says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to Yahuwah, our Elohim. On it you shall not do any work, you nor your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant. For in 6 days Yahuwah made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahuwah blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." That is the fundamental commandment. And the question is, we both agree 6, then 7. On the seventh day we rest. And the question is, when does the cycle start? And when does it continue? So I believe that the Sabbath day is on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th day of each month. Regardless of how you start your month, on the sliver of the dark moon or the full moon, that's a separate point. We're just going to focus today on, is the Sabbath a continuous weekly cycle or not? So this is the insight I had, and I would like to get Adam's opinion on it. Is the word day on Sabbath day is yom. It's the Hebrew word yom. And it has several different meanings depending upon context. It could refer to the daylight period as opposed to the night. It can refer to a 24-hour calendar day, but it can also be an abstract division of time or a period of time. So sometimes it means a year or a lifetime. So like in the day of so-and-so, or in prophetic terms, a day is a year or a day is 1,000 years.
Right, like the day of the Lord, the day of Yahweh. Right. Okay, understood.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So those
Tracking.
are all different uses of the word yom, which is almost in an abstract kind of way, just refers to a unit of time, and you have to determine what that unit is from context. So in the context here of this commandment, it says, remember the Sabbath day. And then it talks about 6 days followed by a seventh. It talks about a week. So the unit of time we're dealing here that this is describing is a week. So I'm going to propose an alternative interpretation of this, which is to remember the Sabbath a week, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh daylight is a Sabbath unto your Elohim. So that's another point on the Sabbath. I believe it's just the daylight hours. So on it you shall not do any work. He rested in 6 daylights, and in the seventh daylight, he did the work in 6 daylights. Sorry for all that. And he rested on the seventh daylight. Therefore, Yahuwah blessed the Sabbath daylight and made it holy. So all I did is change which interpretations of the word yom I'm using here to provide a different context that reads consistently. And to add further support to this concept that it's talking about a Sabbath week versus just a week is the unit. The week is the thing that needs to be viewed as something that is holy in and of itself, is Leviticus 23, verse 15, where it talks about, you shall count from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf wave offering. 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. If a Sabbath can be complete, what is an incomplete Sabbath? And my interpretation of this is a Sabbath is a Sabbath week, has to be complete. It's not 3 days. It's not a Sabbath day that should be complete, but a Sabbath week, which is 7 days ending with a day of rest. So that's just some definitional or alternative definitions. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, Adam.
Well, the issue I have up front is when it says remember the Sabbath Yom. I mean, as we know that there is a Hebrew word for week, which is Shabua. So if that interpretation was correct, Moses could have easily written remember the Shabua to keep it holy. And so, switching the words there, it kind of, I don't know, that makes it a little dangerous for me. But
It could
when
also be Sabbath period or
yeah.
Sabbath time period, time span.
And I guess in that interpretation, to me at least, just changes the concept of what's trying to be spoken here, as in he's okay. So he is talking about, he's referencing a week, 6 days, and then resting on the seventh. So I agree. A week is being discussed here. But the point of that passage, in my understanding, is to show that this individual day is set apart or different than the other 6 days. So it wouldn't make sense to me to say, remember this week to keep it holy, right? I don't know. To me, it just changes the whole concept of what he's
What
trying to
I'm
say.
trying to present here is that
Mhm.
at the very least in Leviticus 23:15, there's a concept of a complete and an incomplete Sabbath.
Hmm.
So how do you
What's
define
that
the Sabbath?
Hebrew word there, Leviticus 23:15, for seventh Sabbath shall be.
Shabbat, I think.
I'd like to maybe just take a look at that. That may help me kind of wrap my mind around what you're trying to um put forward here. So seventh Sabbath shall be, what does it say in the KJV? I'm just gonna uh verse 15, Sabbath shall be complete. I'm gonna take a quick look at that Hebrew word. I'm just curious.
Shabbat.
Shall
H.
be H85. What is this? 85:49. Tamim. That's kind of interesting. Complete here. Let me do this here. Oh, you got it. Okay, you got it up there. That's not the word that's being used there, though. I'm talking about the word
Yes, it
complete.
is. So 7 Shabbat, which could be a week.
The bottom word. That's what I was interested in. Shall be complete.
Complete entire of time.
Yeah. Okay.
So
I mean, I guess I just don't know of an existence of an incomplete week, conversely with complete week.
My point is, a week is a unit of time
Sure.
that can be, and when we have the concept of a week as a unit of time, that also helps us understand something else that I'd like to present. I'm presenting it as an alternative perspective on the text, not saying that it's absolutely right or absolutely wrong. Just it's a perspective to hold in mind that a Sabbath can be, what's a partial Sabbath? What's the division? What's the unit that a Sabbath is divided into? We were talking about complete Sabbaths versus
So
an incomplete Sabbath.
with that, I would like to just share. I think this is just a good point for me to share one of my points. Is there? Would you mind? Let me just do a quick screen share, because I agree. A week should be defined, and it is a measure of time. And I think the Hebrew language kind of lends some credibility that the Sabbath is proof of being 7 days, not 8 or 9. If you look at the Hebrew word sheba, this is for seven. You look at the sheen, bait, and so let's take a look at the word Shabbat. So then we got Sheen, Beit, and Tav. So you've got Sheba meaning seven, Shabbat, right? And then of course, then you have the Hebrew word week, which is Shabu. Oh, you still have that Sheen, Beit, and the Ayin here. So with Sheba, seven, you get Sheen, Beit, Ayin, and then week is Sheen, Beit, Ayin with a Vav added in the middle here. So my point I'm trying to say here is just the Hebrew language itself, in my opinion, shows us that a complete week is 7 days, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The biggest issue I have with the lunar Sabbath is you don't always get 7 day weeks. And as you know, sometimes you get the 8 day week, and I think 9 sometimes. I guess.
Actually, no, you never get a 7 or 8 day week, because the definition of a week is a unit, that they're indivisible. Right.
And
So
that's what I'm trying to establish here is I believe the Hebrew language tells the story with Sheba, meaning seven, and doesn't mean anything else other than seven, is related here to Shabbat and Shabua, which I think it all ties to the same thing. You have seven here, you see the seven here, and the seven here. So
we both agree that a week is defined as 7 days. A week is not defined as the period of time from one Sabbath daylight to another Sabbath daylight. That's not the definition of a week. A week is always 7 days. The question is, can there be days outside of a week? And that's the sticking point that is there. And so what I like to do is, well, how can we prove one way or the other? Because it doesn't say when the Sabbath cycle begins or when the Sabbath cycle ends. And so my problem with the continuous weekly cycle is a mathematical problem. If you take two people, right, take two clones of Adam Fink and go back to the days of Noah, and you're keeping the Sabbath perfectly. One of your clones goes east, one of your clones goes west. You both end up in the United States, and you will not agree on which day is the Sabbath when you arrive there. And that means that it's impossible to have a single day of the week on a continuous weekly cycle. It's always a tradition of men, and it depends upon the direction your ancestors traveled, as well as the direction you travel. Because if you were to go backwards one day around the globe and come back, ignoring the international date line, just counting sunrises and sunsets, then you would, of course, disagree with yourself. So what's your thought on that?
It's above my pay grade, and the way I think. I'm not. I know you shared this with me before, but I just don't know how to even quantify someone going east or west, and then coming up with a different Shabbat. I don't know. I don't know how to arrive there or how to answer it. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't know. So maybe you got me on that point. It just over my head a little bit.
That's my mathematical one. The way I visualize it, if you're in an airplane that's traveling at the same speed the sun is moving, and you go with the sun, you'll never see the sun set, and you arrive back at your destination. And if you go against the sun, you'll see twice as many sunsets when you arrive back at your destination. So if you just count that, then you'll see it's very obvious. Now, it's because of your traveling, your perspective is moving, right? Your frame of reference is moving on the earth. And you could walk it, you could do it. It's about the distance you moved on the earth is going to adjust how much of the day. Because if the sun was standing still and you instantaneously move someplace else, you would see a big jump as well. So there's an element of location there that determines it. And the international date line, which separates when one day begins and the other day ends on a calendar, didn't exist until 100 and some years ago. And it certainly didn't exist thousands of years ago. So that's the problem, is the international date line is a creation of man that's not described in biblical text anywhere. And you need an international date line of some kind in order to have a continuous weekly cycle that is consistent. So that's my logical proof of why it can't be that way. But you could say, well, the international date line is Jerusalem, and everything is left or right of that. But if that's the case, then if you're in China, then you might be doing your Sabbath on the wrong day because you're using the wrong international date line. And so that really complicates the matter. You just can't go off of the Gregorian international date lines. And there are countries like in the Pacific Ocean where they change the law, and all of a sudden the Seventh-day Adventists have to start worshiping on Sunday if they were to just keep the cycle continuously like they had been, or they can go with what the law said. And that's a real problem for those people. How do you address the people that are living in countries near the international date line where by government decree Saturday and Sunday can change?
I don't know how to navigate the laws of men and those kind of things. Again, everything that I've got here is just purely scriptural based. I just want to just kind of share on the point of the Sabbath, regardless of the travels of people. What I look at is the simplicity of the scriptures. Genesis 2 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, Elohim ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And Elohim blessed the seventh day," which I could be wrong. I'm just the way I'm interpreting it, at least just where I'm at, is this to me seems like there is a specific day of the week that he blessed. And based off of what I was sharing with you earlier with the Hebrew language, it seems a week is 7 days, nothing more, nothing less. I believe that he specifically blessed this day that comes around each week without fail, and sanctified it or made it holy, because that in it he had, this word is Shabbated, he had Shabbated from all his work which he had made. And so the perspective I'm taking, of course, it's nothing new. I believe that
I mean,
Yah
I
made.
understand what you're saying. You're repeating the same thing. Like there's a cycle, and 1 week always follows the next week. And what I'm saying is you can have a week, like unleavened bread is a week, and it's a week that doesn't necessarily a week don't necessarily have to be back to back. You can have days between weeks if you view a week as a bundle. And we had the problem of how do we know that Saturday versus Monday versus Wednesday was the one from creation that man didn't mix up which one it was, because the only way we know the cycle is the tradition of men. Now we can start to get into like historical texts and things back to Yeshua's day. But I would like to propose another test that we can use. And this test, I'm going to share my screen here for a second.
I do just want to mention, there are, as Daniel mentioned, there are several historical records that showed, at least in the time of Messiah, that the Romans' day of Saturn, their seventh day, lined up. It was the same day as the Shabbat. We know that's because that's actually when they had decided to attack the Jews. Each time was on the Sabbath, which coincided with their day of Saturn. Then there's historical records all throughout the 2nd century, 3rd century, showing that the early Christians, before the Roman Catholics came in, the early Christians were keeping on the continuous Saturday. So,
yeah, I understand completely that. I think part of the reason why the temple was destroyed was because they switched to Saturday Sabbath, worshiping the star of Saturn. as Stephen called out. So I have no doubt that at that time they had switched to that. But there is something I'd like to point out is in the Talmud, which I take not as scripture or anything like that, but just as a historical claim, they made the claim that there's a priestly rotation schedule where there are basically 24 divisions or households which are responsible for performing the services in the temple every week. And this was set up by King David, and these are the 24 priestly divisions. And at the end of the 24th division, it goes back. So every week, there would have a different person rotated through doing the temple service. It's as if you had a church with 24 elders, and every week a different elder gave the sermon and gave the message. That's what was going on. And we know from records that the cycle was uninterrupted or kept consistent from King David all the way till the time the temple was destroyed. And in the Talmud, it tells us that the division or the family in charge of the temple when the first temple was destroyed, Solomon's temple, and in 70 AD was Jehoiada, which is division 1. On the 9th of Av, that division was in the temple. So we know that they've been rotating on a 24-week continuous cycle. And we know this cycle is also relevant because of John the Baptist's father, who was in the priestly division of Abijah, which is the 8th division. And so he was serving in the temple on that particular week, and that's when the angel came to him. And so from this priestly division cycle, we can actually identify when John the Baptist was conceived, when Yeshua was conceived, his birthday, and all that other. But the important thing to me was that we've got 2 years and 2 dates, 9th of Av in both years, where we know that it was the same division. So we should be able to count the number of weeks between those 2 years and find out if that number of weeks is divisible by 24. Now, in a lunar Sabbath, there are 4 weeks every single month. And in the continuous weekly cycle, there are, I guess, 52 and a fraction weeks every solar year. And in the solar calendars, there's exactly 52 weeks every year. So we've got these different calendars, and if the Talmud and Josephus are right, they only have a 5% chance of being accidentally right, which means that if we can find something that's evenly divisible, then that's strong evidence that it wasn't an accident that they were right, and that it's actually pointing to how the weeks were reckoned in the priestly cycle. So I went and this is a whole different study. I'm not going to get into it, but I've proven that the 9th of Av in 587 BC, that's when the first temple fell, and 70 AD is the other temple. And this is because we know that there were 14 years after the city fell, Ezekiel 40 Jubilee, and of course, the years of Nebuchadnezzar. Those are well-established dates, but 587 BC is the year I used. And then I calculated, and I also tested because 586 is the other one. So I can test 2 different years to see if either year works. And in the continuous weeks, it's off by 5 weeks. So there's an extra 5 weeks in there. And in lunar weeks, it's off by less than 1 week. And that error is in my estimate of the ratio of years with 13 months versus years with that. And so you would round that down, but I didn't complete it. So that lunar weeks lines up, continuous weeks does not. And of course, 586 BC, it doesn't work for either one. They're both off. And I also did this for the solar Dead Sea Scroll calendar, and it's even more off. So there's only one calendar system that allows the statement to be true, that if they rotate a division every 24, from that year, from the 2 years between them, that you would go from Jehoabib to Jehoabib and get the same priestly cycle. What are your thoughts on that?
Our brains work differently. Math is just like, oh man. I will just say this. Using the Talmud and Josephus as and I've really tried to pay attention to everything you're saying here. But if the Talmud and Josephus are kind of like pillars of this um experiment, we'll call it that, or test, it's just kind of shaky ground. There's really, I just want to make mention. I don't read the Talmud. I think it's exactly the doctrines of men that Messiah told us to stay away from, and what's the word? What's the word Paul used about the traditions of the Jews, their writings? But anyways, my point being is I don't know that we can trust the Talmud as a source of truth. So to me, that kind of makes this whole test a little shaky. But I mean, it is interesting. I will tell you that, and it's fascinating to me because math is fascinating to me. Math does not come natural to me. So just looking at the numbers, I'm just like, oof, I don't know. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I just don't know exactly.
Let me address the Talmud comment.
Yeah.
I don't view Josephus or the Talmud as a source of doctrine, and I'm not taking their doctrine. I'm taking their claim as a historical claim, a description of something that actually happened, for which they could have no idea could be used to prove or manipulate doctrines. Because if you think about it, the Talmud is also the one advocating Saturday Sabbath as the history and all those other things. So the Talmud is inconsistent with these two claims,
Right.
which is a sign of the Talmud's corruption. They just don't realize how it's inconsistent. And if they knew it was inconsistent, then they would change it so that it would be consistent.
Sure.
But because they didn't have the tools or the foresight to see how this claim that they made about it both occurring on Division 1. The other thing we know about this is Division 1 implies that on the birth of Christ was on the 9th of Av as well, because it shows that he was conceived around Feast of Tabernacles, and Mary was notified around Feast of Trumpets because John the Baptist was conceived 6 months earlier after unleavened bread. And all of that lines up perfectly for him being baptized at Shavuot, going into when he was almost 30, going into the wilderness for 40 days, coming back, and now he's the priestly age of 30. And he can start his ministry with the first miracle being new wine. So those things line up. And after I did this, I discovered that the Jews also have a historic tradition of expecting the Messiah to come on the 9th of Av. I did not know they expected him to be born on the 9th of Av, but I proved it that he was born on the 9th of Av through this process, and then found out that they have the tradition. And the Jews don't think the Messiah has come, so they didn't manipulate it to line up with Yeshua. But nevertheless, it's a confirmation that the priestly cycle is accurate. And if there was a continuous weekly cycle going on, then this priestly cycle here would have been, I think, just that the Pharisees and that tradition switched to Saturday, and that the temple, the people that are running the temple were running the original lunar Sabbath until the temple fell, and then the Pharisees, their doctrine survived, and those that were in the temple got put down. And I think that just like today, there are many different people with different calendars. I think the same thing was back in Yeshua's day, that you had the Essenes with their Dead Sea Scroll calendar. You had people that were using full moon, people that were using silver moon. We don't hear about them all the time, but they're all going on at the same time, and there were disputes between these different sects. So Just because you can prove one sect was observing it one way doesn't mean that that sect was the one and true sect
Right.
at the time.
Earlier you mentioned, or you mentioned several times now Judaism, and they may have switched from lunar Sabbath to the regular Sabbath. And I just want to make mention, as you know, Daniel, one of the things that I've felt led to do in my walk in the ministry is to remove ourselves from the traditions of men, specifically Judaism. I think Judaism plagues this movement more than anything else. Um, people leave lukewarm Christianity and go into this movement and go straight over to being, Jews and adding. So I am with you on we can't do the false doctrines of Jews. Um, but nevertheless, you know that saying, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because Jews do it doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, they read the book of Genesis. That doesn't mean that Genesis is wrong. They read the Talmud more than they read Genesis. But so my point being is we have to, of course, just test each thing before we just throw it out. I don't think we can just throw it out just because Jews do it. Likewise, Christianity, we can't just throw things out just because Christians do it. Christians believe in the Son of God. That doesn't mean we have to throw that concept out. We have to test each things. And so, like I shared with you before, years ago, I was really excited about the lunar Sabbath, but just in just testing it, I just wasn't able to come around. And in doing the research, several kind of things like this came up that are like, it's kind of interesting. And there's some points that are maybe even persuasive. But like I mentioned with you in some of our personal conversations, the way I look at like any major decision with biblical doctrine, I remember the old scale that my grandfather would have, and I'd play with it. And it was an old traditional scale, and it has the weights, and there's little tiny weights, and there's real big heavy weights, and all to balance things and get a measurement. And so I look at things you just presented, like the calendar and the weeks and the cycle. That's like it's an interesting little point. And for me, it would be on one of those little weights, though. The big weights are the scripture, which is really what I hang my hat on.
Well, let me present some more scripture for you then.
Sure, yeah, please.
So I believe that there's this concept of map versus territory. The territory is what you actually observe in the real world, and the map is what it's just a drawing that, in theory, correlates to what you see in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way that you can prove it. If the calendar, the only way that you can prove a map is accurate is to go out in the real world. And you can have 2 or 3 or 4 different maps, and you have no idea which map is real, just comparing the maps to each other, right? And I would view Scripture and the interpretation of Scripture as drawing a map. The Scripture is describing a map, and the interpretation is describing a map. And so how do you know that, say, one interpretation of Scripture? Because we're both reading the same text, right, and we're interpreting it differently, which means there's ambiguity in the language, and you're putting weight on your interpretation, and I'm putting weight on my interpretation. But those are both interpretations. And so I try to create tests. So regardless of which interpretation is correct, it's out there. So if I had a map that says that Miami is up north and it's going to be cold all year, and I go to Miami and it's tropical, I know my map is wrong. And so we have to say, well, what does the map say in that? So we know that Yah will always do things on his true calendar. Mm-hmm. So if we can prove that certain events occurred on his true calendar, and because we've described the events, just like you described the weather in Miami, and does the map say that that's what the weather should be like when we go there? So I look at the crucifixion week as the proof. If we can prove the year of the crucifixion, and I don't even think we really have to truly prove the year, but we have, he has to die, be buried, and rise on the 3rd day. So we know the 3rd day after he was killed was of the 1st day of a week. So that would be a Sunday on traditional thinking. And so if that's the 3rd day, then we know that the 2nd day was Saturday, and the first day was Friday. So we should expect to see that there is a year during which he could have been crucified, where Passover, the 14th of the first month, was on a Friday. And so I went and I proved through many different angles, like lots of different evidences, that it has to be 31 AD as a cross. And that puts Passover on a Tuesday, which is completely incompatible. So there's only one calendar that's consistent with the evidence we have for the year of the cross and the interpretation of a calendar, and that is a lunar Sabbath, which always puts Passover on the fifth day. On the sixth day. Unleavened bread is on the Sabbath, and then he rises on the first day of the week. That's always the case on the lunar Sabbath calendar, but it's never, it's only occasionally the case on a continuous weekly cycle. And so when you go back and you look at all the years from 28 to 33, Thursday is the best you can get, unless you are really flexible with the variability on the sighting of the sliver moon being very subjective that year, not objective. So that's the other proof that I have, that the closest you can get is 30 AD with a Thursday. And I know because of all the evidences that exist for the Shemitah cycle, the Jordan River crossing, and all those things, I know that in 29 AD, on the Day of Atonement, that's when he proclaimed liberty to the captives. That's when he went and read Isaiah 61. And then they tried to throw him off a cliff. So if that occurred in fall of 29 AD, he can't be killed 6 months later, because he has most of his whole ministry is after that period of time. So we know 30 AD is out the window, which means 31 AD is impossible on a continuous weekly cycle. What are you thinking of that?
You know, I remember you sharing this with me before, and again, it's interesting. And these are all little, these are all little things to take into consideration. And I appreciate you sharing this, and it's something to take into consideration. But when I there's just some things that are just in my mind that are, when you explain it, like, you know, can we trust 100% the accuracy of the keeping of the calendar back in the first century? Do we know the exact dates? There's so many variables at play here that, again, just going back to the simplicity of the scriptures, that's where I'd like to, just make a couple of responses, if you don't mind, just of my position and how the findings of your study, as fascinating as it is, I think still contradicts the scriptures slightly. And I'd like to share a couple of points. So Leviticus 23 is actually used by both the lunar Sabbatarian crowd and the continuous week. And of course, it just comes down to an interpretation. I just want to just share the interpretation I have on that. So Leviticus 23, and Yahweh spake unto Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, say to them concerning the feasts of Yahweh, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. And so right here, this chapter here is about his feast. So we can agree that the Sabbath is a feast, because the very next thing is 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation. You shall do no work in it. It is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of Yahweh, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their season. So, Daniel, this is just what I see here, right or wrong. So
Okay,
number one,
perfect,
yes.
Perfect. You said proclaim in their seasons, right? So what sign did he give us for determining seasons?
So here, let me just, before we get into that, let me just show you just what I'm seeing. I may answer actually your question. What I see here is a division of two different types of calculations. Number one, I see, number one, for the Sabbath, he tells us how to calculate. He says he doesn't tell us to calculate according to Genesis 1:14. He says 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest, right? And then he goes on to say, These are the feasts of Yahweh, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. That word moed, which does bring us back to Genesis 1:14, what's signaling to me is, hey, I just told you how to calculate the Sabbath. Now I'm going to tell you how to calculate the Passover, the first fruits, unleavened bread, and so on and so forth. So that's how I see it there. And then my caution, as I've shared with you and many others before, my caution is Deuteronomy 4:2, you shall not add to the word which I command you, neither shall you diminish anything from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim. So when I go to the Sabbath, he already told me what to do. And then, of course, going back to
Actually,
Genesis 2, he's showing us this, and we know that this seventh day, the Sabbath was not in relation to the sun or moon because it wasn't even made till day 4. So counting using the sun and the moon is actually irrelevant here. It supersedes that. Um, and
would
so,
you would you agree that the counting is a tradition of men?
no, because he tells us to
How
count,
can you know
like
what
just
day is
counting
the
in
Sabbath
general.
without history, without your father telling you the cycle? How do you know what it is?
Oh, I mean, well, that's my point is as he's telling us the cycle right here is my opinion. Again, he's telling
Okay,
us
but it
here
doesn't
and
tell you when the
here.
cycle starts. So if your father told you that it was starts on Monday instead of Sunday, how would you know which one is correct
I mean, as far as like is Saturday actually the day? And like it could be like,
versus Sunday?
yeah.
There's a continuous cycle is one thing, and then there's when does that cycle start is another. The starting of the cycle is a tradition of men that you're adding. The international date line is a tradition of men that you're adding. So you said don't add anything,
Mm-hmm.
but there's not enough information in the scripture to go either way. So both of us have
That.
to add something. I add that the cycle starts based off of the moon because it says from new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath,
Mm-hmm.
which from my perspective is you go from month to month. A month is a unit of time. Within each month, it's 4 divisions of weeks in that month. And that just repeats
Mm-hmm.
because there's the East Gate needs to be open on Sabbaths and new moons, but not on working days.
Mm-hmm.
How can a new moon occur on a Sabbath, sorry, on a working day? And what do you do with the temple door on that day? So there's these underspecified things, which you're providing an interpretation. And I would like to just make an analogy here because I think that it's very easy for us to confuse our interpretation with what the scripture is saying. And I recognize that there's 2 different interpretations. The scripture is not actually saying, it doesn't give us explicitly when does the cycle begin, just like it doesn't give us explicitly when the international dateline is. And it doesn't, and without that information, you can't be sure, right? So you could take the stance, well, as long as you're doing it every 7 days, it doesn't matter which day, as long as you're consistent, then that works.
I don't take
But
that
I
perspective.
believe you would say that if you were to travel to Israel or China or whatnot, you would keep the Sabbath based upon whatever day they consider Saturday to be. And if you go to one of these islands in the Pacific, you would keep it on whatever day they say, even if they changed it recently. And you wouldn't count it based on the number of sunrises or sunsets you saw while you were observing the airplane. So you wouldn't use your subjective experience of sunrise and sunset for determining it. You'd be using the tradition of men, which is outside of scripture. So you can't say that you're not adding or removing. You're just adding a different assumption than I've added in order to fill in the thing. So I say, I don't know which one is true. I'm going to create tests, test
Mm-hmm.
against history, test against priestly cycles, the crucifixion week, logic of, if 2 people were following the rules perfectly, could they ever come to a point where they disagree on what time was the Sabbath in a particular location? And all those different tests tell me which interpretation is plausible and which one's not. And I think there's an analogy here that a lot of people can probably relate to. And that is when it comes to the topic of flat Earth, people look at the scriptures and the Earth can never move, right? Shall not be moved is one of the verses. But that word move could also be interpreted as removed, or the earth will not be destroyed or taken away.
Mm.
And so those are subjective things, but when you substitute your subjective interpretation for this is what the scripture says, that's when you've added your interpretation becomes the addition, versus recognizing that any interpretation you have is separate and distinct from his word, because his word is true. The true interpretation is true, but how we interpret it is not necessarily the truth. So we have to always test all things. And that's why I create these tests. And these tests, I understand, are harder to follow, but the idea that the continuous weekly cycle is the simplest thing is like saying the flat earth interpretation is the simplest. And I know you are there on both, but I think that it's if even though you have to do math and study things to prove the earth is a globe, you have to do math and other things to prove which of these interpretations of the week is consistent with the rest of the text and with the rest of the historical record. And that's why I am on the lunar Sabbath, not because it's easier, it's totally inconvenient.
Yeah, that's
But
true.
because I can't make all the facts that I've been given reconcile with the continuous weekly cycle.
So, a couple things. So I believe that Yah created the 7-day week at beginning of creation, and I believe it's been going ever since, and it's never stopped. Again, there's some historical data showing that I'm not going to read all this, but there's historical data showing that at least in the first century, the Romans day of Saturn was the exact same day as the Jews Saturday. So at least 2,000 years ago, we see that the 7-day cycle survived 4,000 some odd years from creation to roughly 2,000 years
Can I
ago. So if
provide
it
an alternative interpretation of the same fact?
Sure.
On a lunar Sabbath, occasionally Saturday is the Sabbath.
So it happened coincidentally, it happened within 100 years of each other, that the same thing happened in two different instances. You can look it up with the Roman history with Cassius Dio. So that would be incredible odds, but nevertheless, it could happen. I agree. But my point being
One out
is
of 7 Sabbaths align on the same, 1 out of 7 Sabbath days align with the lunar Sabbath. So you have a
sure.
1 in 7 chance that 2 random
Yeah.
events being described would happen on a Saturday.
So at least with those two witnesses, to me it seems very plausible that the 7-day cycle at least was preserved for 4,000 years. So in my reasoning mind, if it was preserved for 4,000 years, well, what's another 2,000? Could it still be the same 7-day cycle today? That's a perspective I have. And as far as math, I'm not good with the big numbers, but the small numbers I can handle. As far as my intellect, because it says here, let's go to the 10 Commandments. Let's go to Exodus 20. And it says, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Shabbat to Yahweh. So just 6 and 1. That's all he says. And so I'm with you on testing it out, practical application. So I think I was sharing with you my testimony. I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago. I was interested in this and I was ready to make this change, especially because I didn't work for someone else. I worked on my own. So I was like, okay, I can do this. Like I don't work for a company that will tell me to, you know, tell me to go somewhere if I came to them with this kind of work schedule. So I was able to do it. But what I looked at was this, and I don't know if this is the same thing that you look at. Some people call these extra days in the lunar Shabbat extended worship days, non-counting days,
Extended new moons.
extended new moons. And so when I agree with you that things should be tested and proved out. And so in looking at this and looking at wanting to do this, I looked at this as an issue, because if the only instructions that he gave us was 6 plus 1 is the seventh, then how can I reconcile? This is I don't know if this is the same method you take a look at, but it says right here, extended worship days are necessary in order for the lunar Sabbath calendar to function properly. And what happens is, as Daniel says, you'll have 4 weeks, but on one of those weeks, you'll have these extra days. You have this extended worship day. So you have, you have the new moon day, then you have the Sabbath a week later. That's good. Sabbath a week later. That's good. Sabbath week later. Same thing. And then same thing. But then in order for it to work with the moon, you have these extra days that are added. And so for me, that was
Your assumption is that all days have to fall within a week, which is recursively going back to an assumption of continuous weekly cycle. So
I mean, that's all he gives us. Again,
no, he doesn't give us any information that says the cycle continues. In fact, he gives us that there are at least 3 types of days: new moon days, work days, and Sabbath daylights. Now, here's my take on this, just from a different perspective. There's this 13th month that we have to insert periodically. And he doesn't explicitly describe it. And in fact, many places it's really hard to find the 13th month in Scripture. And yet it's necessary in order to keep things lined up with the life cycle of plants. So
that's a fair point. I do think that you can find intercalation in Enoch, but I know you don't consider it Scripture, so your point remains. But is something as foundational as every single week, you'd think he'd give us some sort of instruction about these
that's
extra
the
days.
Sabbath to Sabbath. Sorry, new moon to moon, Sabbath to Sabbath tells you that month to month, a month is a unit of time, and then the month is subdivided into weeks, and then the weeks are subdivided into days, with ending in there. So all those commands it's like looking at inside a building block, or a week is a building block.
Mm-hmm.
And he describes the structure of the week, but it provides no description of the structure of how weeks are connected to each other or where they begin or end, except we do know that everything else in Scripture is reckoned from the beginning of a month. And so month to month, Sabbath to Sabbath tells me that, you go in big leaps, year to year, month to month, day to day, right? You go from the big jumps of time, then you break down into the smaller ones. And I agree that I don't like, because we're swimming in the environment of continuous weekly cycle, right? We've grown up, it's just natural to us. And this extra day, like, what do you do with it? And if you go back to a 360-day calendar, like they had in the days of Noah, or that it appears to be prophetic in the future, then you'd always have 30 days, and you'd always have that extra day there between months. So that's something that's aesthetically awkward for people who are grew up with one way of doing things. But my perspective on this is, I don't care if it's aesthetically awkward. If it's consistent with the other facts, then that's what it is.
Right.
So I'm not going to lean on my own understanding of why. I'm going to look at Crucifixion week and say, I know that it has to be within this range of years. I know that this is the days of the week, and I can put all that together and say that description of that week and that first day and that last day and Passover and all that unambiguously proves to me that there's only one calendar that can consistently be interpreted with Scripture. And that's if you have this. And now this is an aesthetic thing, but it's not incompatible. It's just,
well, I mean, I would disagree a little bit. To me, this is the issue for me, and this is the sticking point. Just on a personal level, this is why I can't get on board with the lunar Sabbath. Is this right here, the extended worship day or non-counting day? I just want to read, and this may not reflect what Daniel believes, but I just want to read real quick. Observance of the extended worship day or non-count day or whatever, or inner day. It says extended worship days are not considered to be days of the work week, since the Bible states that the Sabbath follows 6 working days, examples. Therefore, they cannot be considered working days or a Sabbath days, but something else which does not involve working and is not specifically a Sabbath. Working at an occupation on an extended worship day is not permitted, but non-occupational work, i.e., mow the lawn, can still be performed. This screams traditions of men all over the place. You can't find anything about this in the Bible. And so to me, what I weigh is Yah says work 6 days, rest the seventh. This method of lunar Shabbat says work 6 days, rest the seventh, but sometimes you're going to have another Shabbat where you can't work. And so to me, that screams red flags all over the place. And this was where I
Well,
just could
sometimes,
not, I could not. And thankfully, they're at least honest here. It says there is no mention of observing extended worship days in the Bible, nor is there a Hebrew term for extended worship day. There are also no historical writings that describe the observance of extended worship days. So for me, again, this is not condemning you, Daniel, or anyone else that observes this. This is just why I couldn't jump on board because to me, that is adding to the commandments. You're literally commanding people to rest another day that we don't find anywhere in scripture. And for me, that's like, I don't know.
well, so first off, this is what certain people choose to do. I don't think that they even say that these are not commandments. This is just their tradition,
Mhm.
right? And it's an interpretation. So I don't think that you can, there's some people treat it as, hey, he doesn't say what you can or can't do on that day, so you can do whatever you want on that day. And that's just like the 13th month. The Bible doesn't explicitly say it, but we add it and then we do whatever we're going to do. And things like Purim and things get moved around based on that 13th month. But the point is under specification. There's lots of things in the Bible that are underspecified, and we have to fill in the blanks by we got point A and point B, and we draw a line between it. And we're making an assumption about that line is not law.
Mhm.
Not saying it's a command from Yah, and we're not condemning anyone for however they want to interpret that extra day. I'm leaning on treating it like new moon days. But so far, and that's just a recent thing, but I fluctuate back and forth what I do on that particular day. But generally, I view it as an unspecified day where there are no restrictions or laws that you can condemn anyone for, and it's up to each of us to decide what to do with it. I don't think because it's not labeled as a work day, like he has to give us permission to work. It's just unspecified. So when in doubt, it's unspecified. You seek him and you seek his will and you pray, and you can't go wrong with seeking him on any particular day.
That's true. We can agree on that.
You know, if you make your work about doing his business, then it doesn't really matter what day of the week it is. But the main point is the process of seeking the truth.
Mhm.
And I've taken a process which I can trust my process because I understand the history, I understand the math, and not everybody is able to follow that process and have confidence that they've done it correctly or that they're not being deceived along the way, right? Because you get in various sources. And so the key issue is your heart. And if your heart is toward obedience to him and you're keeping a Sabbath, then eventually when he comes, in 40 days or less, if I'm correct,
I hope.
on October 9th, then he'll reveal all things to us. And he's looking for those who have a heart of obedience instead of a heart of, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do what I want.
Right.
And people who honestly misunderstand something, I pray that there's mercy on them because I want him to have mercy on Adam. If I'm wrong, I want him to have mercy on me.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's the key takeaway, because we are not to judge or condemn our brothers. That's Yah's job. We don't know their hearts. I'm not supposed to say, Adam, you fool, you're doing it.
Uh-oh, hellfire.
Oh yeah, right. A fool is anyone, not just what we consider a fool today, but anyone who you're claiming is not doesn't believe in Yah and is not being saved, right? Do not judge someone else's salvation.
And I think the longer I've been doing this, I really have reformed my understanding of Colossians 2:16, being that let no man therefore judge you in meat or drink or in respect of holy day or the new moon or the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come. And the word "but" is not there. The body is of Messiah. Point being is, I'm not judge. I'm not to judge you, Daniel, on your observance of the Shabbat. I cherish you as a brother that is sold out to Yah and recognizes the command for the Sabbath, and you're doing it with all your heart, soul, and mind. So, and I could be wrong, but I believe when Messiah comes back, he'll receive you. Even if my from my perspective is right and you're wrong, I believe that the Messiah that I follow, I believe I could be wrong. I can't speak for him, but I think he would gladly and say, Daniel, come on, you did the best you could, brother, or son, or whatever you would say to you. Um, come into the joy of your master. We'll teach you the 7-day continuous cycle now. I'm just I think, and so therefore I think that's what Paul's really talking about. So hey, don't judge me because I want to eat beef and you think that beef is bad. You think that we're supposed to eat the Garden of Eden diet and you only eat vegetables, and don't judge me because I eat meat. And I won't judge you because you don't eat meat. Or in drink, hey, I'm a Nazarite, so I don't drink wine anymore. Don't judge me that I don't drink wine, and I'm not going to judge you because you do drink wine.
What
Or
about pork?
now that's different. That's not food. Pork is not considered food according to Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. So, I'm not going to judge you in that, but as your brother, I would share with you of what the scriptures say, and
That's,
that.
that's the point. Our job is to point to scriptures and just give people evidence and test their consistency in their logic, and just to make sure people are aware of things. And that's what we're doing here. That's why we're having these discussions, so that everyone can have all the facts on both sides and understand how two brothers honestly seeking the truth, desiring to be obedient, can come to different conclusions.
Yeah.
And because each person has their own capabilities, their own gifts, and maybe, I know that the Sabbath days and these things are really important for figuring out prophetic timing of things. But as far as salvation, yeah, we have a tradition of how things are named here. And that's no different than the tradition of the new moon being named after the start of the month, because all the cultures of the world started the month on the dark or sliver moon. And so that, it's obvious that all these things would derive from it. But yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to just share one more thing. Yeah, so so you were kind of just commenting on that, but yeah, one of the things that when I was researching this topic is there was always a heavy focus on the word Saturday, and they're like it always pointing it to Saturn, and we're worship, people that do Saturdays worshiping Saturn. I just want to just mention real quickly that only applies in the English language. You look at the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, what it's called in other languages, and it all relates to the Shabbat. Not all, but most do. I think 90 something percent of them do, and you can see here. Of course, I don't need to read them all off to you. You can take a look for yourself. But the other
Can I point something out though?
yeah, of course.
What did the Jews call the planet Saturn?
It's a good question. I don't know. I know that they called Jupiter
renamed
Zedek.
it something related to Sabbath. So they renamed the star to be. So some of these things you have to be
So
careful about.
that could be what Stephen's talking about, worshiping, Moloch and Remphan, the star of your god Remphan, and so they definitely got into all kinds of crazy stuff. Which brings me to one of my last points is we talk about getting out of Babylon and not doing Babylon stuff. It just so happens that if you take a look at Babylon, not saying that this is makes it wrong, but just a point to bring up. If you look at the 7-day week and the Shabbat that the Babylonians did, it says, counting from the new moon, the Babylonians celebrated every seventh day as a holiday, also called an evil day, meaning unsuitable for prohibited activities. On these days, officials were prohibited from various activities, and common men were forbidden to make a wish, and at least the 28th was known as rest day. On each of them, offerings were made to different gods and goddesses. And anyway, so it just goes on. The lunation of the 29 or 30 days basically contained 3 7-day weeks and a final week of 8 or 9 days inclusive, breaking the continuous 7-day cycle. So it's like, this could be evidence that that they may have, if the Jews did get into it, did they get this from Babylon? I don't know. But nevertheless,
Yeah, so
Babylon did.
it cuts both ways, right?
Sure. I'm just, no,
Because the
and
sliver moon comes from the same thing.
exact, and that's I should have prefaced it with that, but it's just interesting. I didn't know this until recently. I didn't know that Babylon had a lunar week calendar. I had no idea. So this is just recent information for me. So I just wanted to bring it to the table of discussion. Not that this is again some pillar of truth here. I didn't know that, and I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah,
That they had that.
the other factor to consider is that if you go to the Jewish Encyclopedia and a lot of ancient historical records, they do document that the Jews used to keep the lunar Sabbath.
Mhm.
It's not a modern invention. It is something that has existed all the way, in Babylonian times, right? And so the difference between my view and Babylon is I start the lunar Sabbath based on the full moon, and they started based on the sliver moon. You had the same approximate structure of the week. And if you think about it, you go all the way back to Noah, they came off the ark, they're keeping something. And then gradually over time, the calendar is going to get more and more corrupted, inverted, right? Swapping light for dark. And so you would start to see things reversed. The month starting with the dark versus the full moon, the day at night instead of where the year is. And of course, the Sabbath cycle, right? He's going to try to change it over time. So we know this is an ancient thing. The question is, which ancient one is the truth? Because we've got evidence that lunar Sabbaths existed way back in the days of Babylon. And we've got evidence of a Saturday Sabbath in the Roman times. But which one came first, and which
And that's
one?
unfortunately it's these historical documents are supposed to help us with ambiguous scripture, but then if the historical records are ambiguous too because it shows both sides, it's like, man, what do we rest on? Yeah.
Right.
So
That's why I try to come up with tests that the authors of the historical documents
right.
were being descriptive, describing what they saw, rather than proscriptive of declaring a law or a calendar. And then I assume, well, maybe they're correct or maybe they're mistaken, but then we try to test it. So that's why they got the cycles of the weeks, so the priestly cycles. That's why we got Crucifixion week. We got the Gospels, which describe it in great detail. And so that's my process, and I think the process is what's most important. But of course, you have to follow the truth. Don't follow any man, because you're just substituting their judgment for your judgment, and we don't want to do that. That's how cults get formed, and people can be led astray, because if you're following them and then they make a mistake or they fall into sin, now you've got a crisis. Are they wrong about everything? What can you trust from them? So you always have to follow and do your own homework, do your own research,
Right.
prove to yourself. And my message is it's possible to prove these things out. And that if you're willing to do the math and study the history and learn how tools like Stellarium can be trusted and why they can be trusted, then there's more opportunity to have confidence. But if you don't have confidence in all of that, then you have to go with what the simplest thing you can understand without all that additional evidence is. Because people are very, very good at coming up with scientific sounding theories that bamboozle people. And that scientism can lead a lot of people astray.
Yeah.
And it's just like with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the solar only calendar. You got this whole story of the Qumran community, and
It's a fascinating story. It's a captivating, matter of fact.
It's very captivating. And so don't allow people with fascinating narratives to lead you astray. And like, I'm presenting a lot of what I believe fascinating narratives, but I'm just explaining what I believe and why I believe it. And I want to be tested on it. I want to say, well, what's wrong with, where did I make a mistake in my math?
Sure.
Like, I want to find that information. I'm looking for people to challenge that. But recognize that if you just take someone's word and you don't prove it yourself, you won't be able to challenge them, because they need to be challenged by you. Like, I need people to prove it out. Did my math and cycles of ninth of odds and I thought, does that work out? Someone else needs to do it themselves. Just like you don't have a scientist do one experiment and everyone just take their paper.
Right.
You reproduce the experiment. You redo it yourself and you prove it to yourself. And it's only by doing that that iron can sharpen iron.
Hallelujah. And that's the point of these conversations. So
Yeah.
thanks for
having me.
sharpening with me. I've got a few more points, but I think we've both, kind of made our case. Unless you have anything else that you wanted to add.
No, I
Okay.
think that summarizes it. And thank you so much for coming on and doing this. And I guess we'll see you next week.
All right. Shalom. Shalom, everyone.